I never thought I would write this, but there are things that we keep inside for so long that they start to weigh on our chest. And then there comes a time when you either let it out or suffocate. So here I am, not to dramatize my life or romanticize suffering, but because there was a specific day that turned my world upside down. And I wanted to share it. It was supposed to be just another ordinary vacation. I was tired of the college routine, the noise of the city, the constant pressure to be good enough at everything. So I decided to spend a few days at my parents' house, in a small town in the countryside where I grew up. You know, the kind of place where time seems to move slower? That was what I was looking for. But I had no idea that that break would turn into the beginning of the biggest emotional upheaval of my life. On my second or third day there, I decided to take a walk along the dirt roads. It was something I used to do when I was a kid, just to clear my head. I grabbed a bottle of water, put on some sneakers, and went. The problem was that after a while, everything started to look different. The forks in the road, the fields, the gates, everything was a bit confusing, as if my childhood memories no longer matched reality. After almost an hour of aimless walking, I realized I was lost. That's when I saw a huge farm with a wooden gate and a path that seemed to lead to a house. The idea was to just ask for directions and go back. But when I pushed, opened that gate and started walking, I had no idea that I was entering the life of someone who was as hurt as he was closed off. Someone who fate seemed to have put in my path to teach me and change me. The farm was huge. The fields seemed endless. And there was an organization that caught my attention right away. Well-built corrals, reinforced fences, everything very well kept. I could tell that there was hard work, and a lot of it, but the silence was almost absolute. No cars, no people, just the distant sound of horses and the wind. That's when I heard hooves pounding on the dirt floor, and when I turned, I saw a man approaching on horseback. Tall, imposing, with that manner that commands respect just by looking at him. He wore a hat that hid part of his face, but even from a distance I could tell that he was not at all happy with my presence. When he stopped in front of me, he got straight to the point. He wanted to know what I was doing there. His voice was firm, almost cold, but not rude. It was the kind of tone that made you think twice before answering anything rude. I responded as calmly as I could. I said I was lost and just wanted directions back to town. He dismounted in a movement that seemed choreographed. Quick, precise, like someone born in a saddle. He was even more intimidating up close. Broad shoulders, serious gaze, an air of someone who wouldn't open up to anyone. "You know you're on private property, right?" he said, his arms crossed. That made me want to turn away right then and there, but I took a deep breath and explained that there was no one around for me to ask, that I wasn't there to disturb or invade anything. I just wanted to find my way. Inside, my heart was racing, not just because I was scared, but because somehow there was something about that man that moved me. A strong presence, a heavy silence, as if he was hiding more things than he was letting on. He stared at me for what seemed like an eternity, as if trying to decide whether I posed any threat. Then, without saying anything else, he climbed onto his horse and nodded, indicating that I should follow him. I walked behind him, not knowing what to expect. We didn't say a word until we reached a main dirt road. There, he pointed us back to town and said I would be home in 15 minutes. I thanked him, still a little embarrassed, but genuinely relieved. "Try not to get lost again," he said before turning and riding back. And I stood there for a few seconds, watching him go. I had no idea who this man was, but there was something about him that made me uneasy. Coldness with care, distance with presence. A contrast I couldn't understand, I could only feel. That night, during dinner, I mentioned it to my parents. They exchanged glances, and my mother was the first to say, "You went to Manuel Antunes' farm." The name seemed to hang heavy in the air. My father added, "He's the most reserved man in this town. A widower. They say he lives alone with his horses and hardly talks to anyone." That made me even more curious. A few days later, I heard from a neighbor that some of the horses on his farm were feeling unwell. No one knew exactly what it was, but they said they were exhausted and not eating properly. At that moment, my instincts as a veterinary student spoke louder. I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my backpack with the basic instruments I had taken for the trip and went there again, determined to help. I knew he probably wouldn't like to see me again, but something inside me told me I had to go back. This time, I went straight to the corrals, without going past the main house. I saw some horses from afar, and a closer look was enough to confirm that something was really wrong. Apathy, hunched posture, some with clear signs of abdominal pain. I was observing one of them from outside the fence when I heard that firm voice behind me again. "You again?" I turned slowly, and there he was, without a hat this time, revealing brown, hair with a few gray streaks at the temples. His dark eyes analyzed me with the same intensity as the first time. I took a deep breath and said firmly, "I heard that your horses are not well. I am a veterinary student. I can help." He crossed his arms and remained silent, as if he was trying to understand what I would gain from this. And honestly, not even I knew how to explain it properly. It was just a desire to do what I loved, and maybe deep down to understand that man too. After an awkward silence, he opened the gate to the pasture and said, "5 minutes. If you hurt any of the animals, you're in trouble." I walked in with my heart racing, more from the impact of his presence than from the horses. But when I started examining them, I focused completely. 3 of them showed clear signs of worm colic, dry feces, pale gums, reduced movement. It was something that could progress quickly if left untreated. I showed him the signs, explained what I suspected, and did a quick test on their feces with a piece of equipment I always carry. When I offered him the magnifying glass to look at the eggs, he came so close that I could smell him. Leather, field, and a faint hint of something that made me want to take a deep breath. He looked at me, nodded, and it was the first time I saw a trace of respect in his eyes, a silent recognition. And there, without me realizing it, something between us began to change. I wrote down on a piece of paper the recommended dewormers and some basic instructions about nutrition and hydration. He stood there watching me the whole time, with his arms crossed, silent, but without taking his eyes off me. When I finished, he simply said, "Can you come back tomorrow?" That caught me off guard. I didn't expect him to want to see me again, especially after the suspicious way he greeted me. I nodded in agreement, and before leaving, he extended his hand. "Manuel." I shook it, said my name, and felt a slight shiver when our hands touched. I can't explain if it was because of his intensity or the surprise of seeing him act so kindly for the first time. I walked back home feeling a strange turmoil in my chest, a mixture of mission accomplished, growing curiosity, and a restlessness that didn't make sense at that moment. The next day, early in the morning, I returned to the farm. This time, I was greeted by an employee at the gate. He said that Manuel was waiting for me in the corral. I went there with a strange feeling of familiarity, as if that place that had been strange yesterday was starting to become a part of me. I found Manuel talking to an older man, who I later discovered was the foreman, João. I asked about the horses, and Manuel answered with less rigidity, even a certain tone of satisfaction. He had bought the dewormer, and João had already started treatment the night before. I examined the animals again, and indeed they were improving. Their posture had changed, their eyes were more lively. "In a few days they will be 100%, I said. Manuel just nodded, but there was something different in his expression, as if he was trying to understand why someone like me, from outside, had cared so much. He asked me if I wanted to take a walk around the farm. He said that since I was there, I could take the opportunity to get to know the place better. And for some reason, I accepted without hesitation. We walked side by side through the pastures, while he explained details about the cattle, the breeds, the planting and harvesting cycles. Manuel spoke confidently, but without arrogance, and that surprised me. I had heard so much about him, that he was closed off, rude, unbearable, and here was a man who seemed more tired than anything else. An old, deep-rooted tiredness of someone who has been carrying too much weight for too long. It was when we reached a more remote corner of the farm that I saw a horse lonesome, visibly limping. I immediately stopped. "That one's hurt." He sighed deeply. "It's Tempestade. He's been like that for days." Without thinking, I asked to examine him. He hesitated, saying that the animal was more aggressive, but then relented. I walked into the pasture calmly, speaking softly, letting the horse feel my presence. Storm was beautiful, imposing, but clearly uncomfortable. I managed to get closer and examined his left hind leg. There was something stuck in his hoof, probably what was causing the pain. When I was done, I looked at Manuel and said directly, "This isn't recent. If it had been treated right away, it wouldn't be like this." He frowned, fell silent, and then said, "The vet said it was just rest." I explained that he needed antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, and daily care. It was then that he looked at me differently, more vulnerable. "Can you take care of him?" I was silent for a second, feeling the weight of what that meant. I said yes, I could guide him. He nodded, and when we said goodbye that day, there was something in his eyes that said more than any words. In the days that followed, I established a routine. I would arrive early, around 8 in the morning, take care of Tempestade, look after the other horses, and then leave at the end of the morning. Sometimes Manuel would show up during the appointments and stay there in silence, leaning against the fence, just watching. At first, we didn't exchange many words, but little by little, he started asking questions. First about the horses, then about me, about college, about life in the capital. I answered everything calmly, trying to stay focused on what had brought me there. But it was impossible not to notice the way he looked at me, as if he no longer knew how to deal with closeness. A look that carried pain, regret, loneliness. And the more I got to know him, the more I realized that behind that tough pose, there was someone drowning in unresolved grief. It was one morning, during one of these appointments, that the conversation took a different turn. We were talking about feeding the horses, and out of the blue, he asked, "You grew up here, right?" I confirmed. I told him that my parents still lived in the same house, that I spent all my vacations there. He was silent for a while, then said, "I bought this farm 10 years ago. Before that, I lived in the capital." That took me by surprise. He seemed to belong so deeply to that place that it was hard to imagine any other reality. I asked what made him leave there, but he deflected. "Let's just say I needed a change." And that was it. But it was enough. The way he said it carried such obvious pain that I didn't have the courage to insist. I just continued what I was doing, respecting his silence. But from that day on, I started paying more attention to everything, because without realizing it, I was starting to care. Storm began to visibly improve. The inflammation subsided. He was able to support his leg more firmly, and his eyes once again showed that sparkle of vitality. I was genuinely happy with his progress, but at the same time, I felt that my presence there was no longer just about the horse. Manuel began to wait for me in the corral almost every day, sometimes with coffee in hand, sometimes with questions about my studies, and once even with a chair so I could rest a little between procedures. He was different from what I had been told. Yes, he was serious, not smiling much, but he was not cold. He was someone who had closed himself off, perhaps as a defense, and that touched me because I was well aware of this habit of building walls around things that hurt. But at the same time, I knew I had to be careful. I was getting involved, and he seemed to be increasingly present in my mind, even outside the farm. It was when he invited me to come see the newly arrived calves that I felt the most obvious change between us. It wasn't just any invitation. It was a gesture from someone who wanted to share, show, and get closer. We walked to one of the more remote pastures. The calves were calm, grazing in the sun, and I took the opportunity to ask him a few questions about caring for the herd. He answered everything with passion and knowledge, and that's when I understood that that farm was much more than just a job for him. It was a refuge, a world that he controlled because perhaps outside of it, he had lost control. I asked, half without thinking, if he ever felt alone in that big place. He looked at me with a tired smile and said, "Sometimes. But that's the price you pay for some choices." That stayed in my head all day. What choices were those? And why, even though he said he was alone, did he seem more comfortable with solitude than with any presence? The next day, something happened that completely messed up everything I had been trying to keep under control. I arrived at the farm as usual, but this time Manuel was not in the corral. It was the foreman, João, who greeted me. He said that Manuel had left early to check on a problem in the north pasture and asked if I could go alone that day. I agreed without thinking much. I already felt safe with the horses and the space, as if part of me had already adapted to that routine. I was examining Tempestade, who was already showing almost complete improvement, when I heard a strange noise coming from the pasture next door. One of the young bulls was agitated, running from one side to the other. When I looked closer, I noticed that he had wires stuck in his leg. I acted on impulse. I grabbed my backpack and went into the pasture. I know it was reckless. I know I could have waited for help. But at that moment, all I could think about was that the animal was in pain. The approach was slow and careful, but the bull was panicking. When I was close enough to try to help him, he turned abruptly and came toward me. I tried to get out of the way, but I tripped on a rock and fell hard to the ground. The pain in my ankle was immediate, sharp, paralyzing. The bull passed me by. Luckily, without hitting me directly, but the shock and pain left me without reacting for a few seconds. I tried to get up and couldn't. I screamed for help, but I was far from the farmhouse. The world seemed too quiet, and the pain was starting to take over my body. It was then that I heard the gallop, a loud, urgent sound, like in a movie scene. Manuel appeared on the horse, got off the saddle before the animal even stopped and ran toward me. What happened? His voice was different, scared, desperate. I explained between short breaths, while he carefully examined my ankle. "It could be broken," he said. "You're going to the hospital now." I tried to argue, to say that maybe it wasn't that serious, but he wouldn't let me. "Stay still," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. And before I could insist, he picked me up with an ease that caught me off guard. His touch was firm but careful. I remained silent the whole time, with my face close to his chest, listening to his rapid breathing, his heart beating fast, perhaps more out of concern than effort. He carefully placed me in the saddle, mounted behind me, and we rode to the headquarters. I was embarrassed, tense, in pain. He was focused, tense, with his hands holding tight to make sure I wouldn't fall. No one said anything, but the silence said it all. I felt that this wasn't just about an accident. It was about his fear of losing, once again, someone he was starting to care about. Arriving at the headquarters, he put me in the truck and drove to the city hospital as if every second mattered. His face was closed, but his eyes, when they looked at me, carried a fear I had never seen before. At the hospital, the diagnosis came quickly. Severe sprain, no fracture, but with complete rest for at least a week. When we left, I thought he was going to drop me off at my parents' house, but he continued on his way back to the farm. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To my house. You're going to stay there until you get better." I tried to protest, to say it wasn't necessary, but he was adamant. "You got hurt on my property, trying to help one of my animals. Now it's my responsibility to take care of you." But it wasn't just responsibility in his tone. There was something more, something between care and the need to keep close what perhaps he wasn't ready to lose. His house was different from what I had imagined. On the outside, it was imposing. On the inside, it was surprisingly cozy. The furniture was rustic but well kept. The rooms were spacious and quiet, but with touches that revealed that a family had once lived there. He put me up in the guest room on the top floor, with a beautiful view of the fields. He carried me upstairs, not letting me try to put my foot down. "Stay here. If you need anything, just call me. My room is right next door." The way he said things had a mix of command and affection that confused me. He said he would get my things from my parents' house. I asked him not to worry, but he was already at the door. When he came back, late in the afternoon, he was carrying a suitcase that my mother had packed and a tense expression on his face. They didn't like the idea. "Who did they?" I asked. "Your parents." And at that moment, I understood that my presence there was already creating a buzz, even though I didn't yet know how big it was. We had dinner in his room. His housekeeper, Mrs. Carmen, brought 2 trays and left us alone. "He was nervous all day," she said with a knowing smile. "I've never seen the boss like that." Manuel appeared soon after, with his own tray, and pulled up a chair next to the bed. We talked about the horses, about my recovery, about the silly things that were distracting us. For the first time, I saw him relax. He spoke more lightly. He laughed at a silly joke I made. It was as if, right there in that room, he stopped being the feared man of the city and went back to being just a man, hurt, lonely, trying to get back to life. I asked about his family and he answered, looking at his plate. "They're far away." There was a silence between the lines that I respected. I didn't insist, but I felt that, little by little, he was trying to open a door that had been closed for too long. And I, without realizing it, had already entered. The next day, I woke up to the soft sound of a knock on the door. It was Manuel bringing breakfast. He was carrying a tray with everything ready, freshly brewed coffee, bread with cheese, and a small jar of jam. "How's your ankle?" he asked without looking me directly. I said the pain had lessened, but it still hurt when I tried to put my weight on it. He nodded silently, placed the tray on the dresser, and sat in the armchair by the window. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if we were learning to share the space calmly. We didn't talk much, but little by little I began to notice his small gestures, his hidden concern, his eyes that sought mine when he thought I wasn't looking. It was strange to be there, so close to someone I barely knew until a few days ago. But it was also natural. as if something inside me knew that this story was just beginning. He spent the whole day at home, but he was always close by. He answered messages, answered the phone, and took care of things on the farm, all from his office. In the afternoon, he went out for a few hours, but left Mrs. Carmen in charge of anything I needed. When he came back, he seemed more tense. I decided not to ask. But that evening, while he was bringing dinner, I noticed that he was quieter than usual. I waited for him to sit down and eat something, and then I asked, "Is everything okay?" He took a deep breath, ran his hand through his hair, and said, "Today my ex-father-in-law showed up at the farm." That caught me off guard. He spoke slowly, as if rummaging through a box he preferred to keep locked. He said that the visit had been tense, that the man had demanded news of his grandchildren, and that he had mentioned Manuel's wife, Helena. It was at that moment that he finally spoke. She died in an accident, and I was never the same after that. "They're 5 years old," he said. "Twins, Pedro and Paula." My reaction was automatic. "Are you a father?" He nodded, but it seemed like he didn't even believe in that title anymore. "They're in a school far from here, boarding school. I thought it would be better this way, for them, for me." I tried to ask why, but he beat me to it. "Because every time I look at them, I see Helena. And every time I see Helena, I hate myself." It was one of the harshest things I've ever heard anyone say about themselves. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that he wasn't to blame for an accident. But I understood that words don't heal guilt when it's already ingrained. I just said that being away from his children didn't lessen the love he felt for them. It just made him more alone. He looked at me for the first time in minutes, and in that look, there was a mixture of pain, fear, and a fragility that he tried to hide from the entire world. That night left a lasting impression on me, not only because of his words, but because of what I felt while listening to everything. It was as if I had crossed a silent border where he let me see a part of him that no one else could see. And even though it was all very intense, I didn't want to back down. On the contrary, I felt that I needed to be there, that he needed someone who wouldn't treat him like a monster, but like a man trying to survive his own mistakes. That same night when Carmen brought me dinner, she said quietly, "He's not easy, but I've never seen the boss so different as he was these days." That confirmed what I already suspected. I was messing with something that he himself didn't know how to deal with. And even with all the insecurities, that made me want to stay. In the days that followed, I began to see Manuel in a different light. He wasn't just the man who kept to himself from the city. He was an absent father trying to find the courage to return, a widower dealing with guilt, a man lost between what he was and what he wanted to be. Living together every day made small gestures more meaningful. The coffee left on the table, the open door to the office, the conversations at dusk, and I, even with my ankle still swollen, began to walk around the house more often. It was as if the place was, little by little, becoming a strange and welcoming home at the same time. One day, between one conversation and another, he said to me, "You make this house feel alive again." I was speechless. I could only smile, not knowing how to say that I also felt alive there, even though I didn't really understand why. It was a cloudy morning on the 10th day of my recovery that everything turned upside down. I could already walk with the help of crutches, and I took advantage of Manuel's departure to take care of something with a supplier to explore the house a little more. I went to the library, a large, quiet room filled with old books and dark wood furniture. I was leafing through a book on horse breeding when I heard raised voices coming from outside. Limping to the window, I could see Manuel in the courtyard, arguing with an older man, well-dressed and with an arrogant posture. The conversation was tense, heavy. I could only catch parts of it, but it was enough. "You can't stop me from checking on them. You abandoned them. They're my grandchildren." And then I heard the name that stuck like a nail in my mind. Helena. The man was the father of Manuel's deceased wife. And suddenly, everything began to fit together. "She died because of you." That was the last sentence I heard before the crushing silence that followed. I went back to my chair, trying to process everything. The man had blamed Manuel directly for his daughter's death. And the worst part was that he didn't deny it. The expression on Manuel's face when he came back inside wasn't just anger, it was defeat. And when he walked into the library and saw me, I knew right away that I had heard him. He didn't ask. He just sat down in one of the chairs, his shoulders slumped, and said, "They're 5 years old. Pedro and Paula. They've been at boarding school since the beginning of the year." His voice was low, without strength. I thought it was the best thing to do, but maybe it was just cowardice. That broke me down inside, because there, in front of me, was a man who punished himself every day for a tragedy, and who, deep down, just wanted a chance to be forgiven by someone, by himself, or by his children. I felt an overwhelming urge to hug him, to tell him that he wasn't alone, that he didn't need to carry all that in silence. But I didn't. At least not yet. I waited for him to continue, and he did. He said that after Helena's death, everything went up in smoke, that he could barely get out of bed, that every corner of the house seemed to scream her name, and that when he saw his children, the weight of guilt was so unbearable that it seemed like it couldn't fit in his body. Every time I look at them, I remember the last words I said to her. His voice broke at that sentence, and as painful as it was to hear, I stayed. I listened, in silence, respecting the pauses, the ragged breathing, the red eyes that he tried to hide with his hands. I stayed because he needed someone to stay, and maybe because, even without admitting it, I needed to be there too. "Do you think they'll hate me?" he asked out of nowhere, his eyes fixed on mine. I answered firmly, "They need you, and you need them. That's what it's all about." He sighed, long and deep, as if trying to expel something that's been stuck in his chest for years. I don't know how to be a father. No one knows until they have to be one, and even then, we learn. That conversation wasn't a miracle. It wasn't the end of the pain, but it was the beginning of something. A shift, a ray of light. In the following days, I noticed he was quieter, but also more present. And then, one morning, he appeared in the room with his cell phone in his hand. I called the school. My heart raced. "They're coming tomorrow. Pedro and Paula." I told him it was an emergency. I looked at him, unable to hide my nervousness. "Are you ready?" He laughed humorlessly. "No, but if I wait until I'm ready, I'll wait forever." That night was long. I could barely sleep. I kept thinking about everything. The children arriving, the emotional burden it would bring, and especially how Manuel would deal with the reunion. The next morning, he barely spoke. He walked around the house as if he were measuring each step, trying to prepare himself for something impossible to predict. At 2 p.m, the school van arrived. I watched everything through the window. Pedro got out first, running to the front of the house, full of curiosity in his eyes. Paula came soon after, more slowly, holding on to the teacher's hand. They both seemed too small for so much silence, and when they saw Manuel, they hesitated. It was Pedro who broke the distance. "Daddy!" he shouted, running to him with open arms. Manuel knelt down and hugged him tightly. I saw his back tremble. Only then did Paula approach, slowly. Manuel received her gently, as if holding something precious and fragile at the same time. After the teacher left, we went downstairs to greet them. Manuel introduced them to me, with the care of someone who understands that affection needs to be built. "This is Lara, a special friend of Daddy's." Pedro, more outgoing, smiled and asked, "Do you live here too?" "For now, yes. I'm helping your father with the horses and now with you too." Paula looked at me carefully, suspiciously, as if she still doesn't know if she can trust me. And that was okay. That was new to her, maybe scary. Later, while they were exploring the house, Paula whispered something in her brother's ear, and he, without filter, said, "She wants to know if you're going to send us away again." Manuel froze for a second. He knelt in front of the two and answered with a choked voice, "No, my loves. You're going to stay here, with me, if you want, forever." And it was at that moment that I understood the weight of the word home. Sometimes it only exists when it is said out loud by someone who finally understands what love is. Little by little, we adapted to the new routine. Pedro felt at home from the first day. He ran through the hallways, asked questions about everything, and wanted to help with any task, no matter how small. Paula was more reserved. She observed a lot, spoke little, and only slept with a light on. Manuel did his best to get closer, but his insecurity still held him back at times. It was as if he was afraid of breaking something with the slightest gesture. I, on the other hand, became a link between them. I helped with meals, baths, games, and difficult conversations. One day when Paula fell and scraped her knee, she ran to me instead of going to her father. Manuel saw it, and even though he tried to hide it, it hurt. That night we talked about it. I told her that her affection was still under construction. You haven't lost her love, you just need to relearn how to be a safe haven. He didn't answer, but held my hand for a few seconds in silence. The presence of the children changed the rhythm of the farm. The mornings became noisier, the days lighter. Pedro loved horses, and Paula started drawing all the animals she saw, filling the refrigerator with colored paper. Manuel started laughing more, still moderately, still interrupted by memories, but there was already life in that laughter. And I was getting more and more involved. One afternoon, as we watched the children playing on the lawn, he looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and confession. You brought them back, and you brought me back too. That pierced me, because it was true, but also because he didn't realize that I myself was being rebuilt there. I had come to seek rest, and I found a chaos full of love, pain, and reunions. But I also found something I never expected. A family being born from what was left of another that seemed to have been lost. The following days were marked by small victories. Manuel began taking his children to feed the horses at dawn, even with sleep in his eyes. Pedro loved helping to carry the buckets, while Paula approached more cautiously, but showed interest. One day she asked to brush the mane of a sick mare that I had been caring for since I arrived. She looks sad, she said. I think she misses someone too. That touched me. There was so much sensitivity in that 5-year-old girl that it was impossible not to see how she carried her father's silences and the emptiness that her mother's absence had left. Over time, she began to sit next to me while I cared for the animals, asking questions, observing every detail. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she would let her hand slip until it touched Manuel's. He would smile, without saying anything, but I knew. She was coming back. One late afternoon, as the sky turned orange, the 4 of us were sitting on the porch. Pedro was sleeping on my lap, exhausted from playing. Paula was resting her head on her father's shoulder, who was gently holding her small hand. The silence between us was comfortable, as if that moment sealed something. And it was then that Manuel spoke, in a low voice, as if revealing a secret. I thought I would never be able to feel this again. Peace. I didn't answer. I just looked at him with a smile and let my head rest against his. After a few minutes, Paula turned to me and asked, "Are you leaving?" I didn't know what to say. I took a deep breath and answered, "Not now." She smiled. "Because I like you here." That broke me inside. Maybe it was simple, almost childish. But in that moment, I knew that it wasn't just Manuel who had found his children again. I had also found a place I could call home. The bond between the 4 of us grew stronger every day. It was as if we were learning to be a family without ever saying it out loud. One Sunday afternoon, Manuel decided to take us to a nearby lake, where he used to fish when he was younger. We brought a picnic basket, a checkered blanket, and even some dumplings made by Dona Carmen. Pedro spent hours trying to fish with a twig, while Paula preferred to get her feet wet and collect special rocks. At one point, when the 2 of them were distracted, Manuel approached me and said, "I never thought I would be able to have something like this again, with the 3 of us." I didn't say anything right away. I just intertwined my fingers with his. It was the first time he held my hand without hesitation, without hiding it. And in that touch, there was a silent surrender, an acknowledgement. He was no longer just the man who carried guilt. He was the man who, little by little, was learning to love again. But like everything that involves real feelings, challenges also came along. Paula had a crying fit one night, saying she didn't want to lose her father again. She was afraid he would disappear like before. Manuel was paralyzed, not knowing how to react. I got down and hugged her tightly. "He's not going away, Paula, and neither am I." She clung to me like someone clinging to the last certainty they have. Then, Manuel knelt down beside us with tears in his eyes and said, "Daughter, I made a lot of mistakes, but I'm here now, and I'm going to stay." It was the first time I heard him call her daughter in a clear voice, without weight, without fear. From that day on, she began to sleep better, and Manuel started leaving the bedroom door ajar at night, "in case she wants to come in the middle of the night," he would say. Small gestures, but they carried a whole world of healing. That week, Paula started calling me Auntie Lara spontaneously. It was a simple nickname, but it sounded like music to me. And Manuel, upon hearing it, didn't correct me or intervene. He just smiled, as if silently approving. I felt like I was taking up a space in their lives that wasn't temporary. I was building something concrete, even if it had no definitions. One day, when I took them both to get vaccinated at the city's health center, the attendant asked, "Are you the mother?" I hesitated for a second, and Paula answered. Before me. She's almost that. In the attendant's eyes, I saw an understanding smile. In Paula's, a trust that moved me deeply. Later, when I told Manuel this, he was silent for a few moments and said, "They chose you, and so did I." I was speechless. It was the first time he had spoken so openly about the two of us. We started to build routines together. We shared the household chores, the farm duties, and family time. On Sundays, it became a tradition to watch old movies in the living room. With popcorn, Pedro always fell asleep before the end, and Paula made sure to comment on each scene. The nights gained a kind of tranquility that I had never experienced before. One night, while we were washing the dishes together, Manuel looked at me and said, "Sometimes I think you showed up here because Helena told you to." I remained silent. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife without pain in his voice, without guilt overflowing. I don't think I could have done it alone. I approached him slowly, dried my hands, and hugged him from behind. "You just needed a chance." He turned, looked into my eyes, and for the first time, we kissed. It was a calm, unhurried kiss, full of everything that didn't need to be said. It was as if we were finally where we were supposed to be. After that kiss, nothing changed abruptly, and at the same time, everything was different. We began to see each other with new clarity, as if something had finally clicked between us. Manuel continued to be reserved and silent, but now there was room for affection, for shared laughter in the late afternoon, for the little touches in the kitchen while we prepared dinner. The children noticed it too. Pedro often asked when we were going to get married, and Paula began to draw me and her father holding hands in her notebooks. It was as if the affection was already there, consolidated in our daily lives. One day, while I was combing Paula's hair, she asked me, "If we get married, will you be my mother?" I answered with my heart in my mouth, "If you want me to be." She smiled and said, "Then I want to." It was the simplest and most overwhelming moment of my life. It was during this rebuilding process that a scare almost knocked us off our feet. It was a quiet afternoon, and the children were playing in the backyard. Paula decided to climb a tree, something she did often, under our watchful eye. But this time, a branch broke. The dry sound of the wood, the muffled scream, and her body falling paralyzed me for an eternal second. I ran to her with my heart racing, Manuel right behind. She was conscious, but she was crying a lot and couldn't move her leg. We called an ambulance, and I accompanied her to the hospital with Manuel. Those were the longest minutes of my life. I held her hand the whole time, telling her that everything was going to be okay, even though I wasn't sure. When the doctor finally showed up, he said it was a fracture, but that she would be fine. I broke down. I felt that, for a moment, everything we had built was hanging by a thread, and I realized that the love that had been born slowly was already vital. During the days that Paula was hospitalized, I practically never left her side. I slept in an uncomfortable chair, my body aching but my soul strong. Manuel took turns with me, taking turns when he had to go back to the farm to take care of the horses and Pedro. And in every exchange of glances, there was a shared certainty. There was no longer me or him. There was only us. Paula was sensitive, but also more affectionate. One morning, she woke up in pain, and while I was adjusting the pillows, she held my arm and said softly, "You won't leave when I get better, will you?" My eyes filled with tears. "Never again," I replied, without thinking twice. And she smiled, even with her tired face. That smile was all I needed to confirm what my heart already knew. I hadn't just fallen in love with a man. I had fallen in love for a lifetime. On the day she was discharged, she left the hospital with a cast on her leg and a sparkle in her eyes. Pedro ran to hug her, and Manuel picked her up as if carrying a miracle. We returned home with an even stronger sense of new beginnings. I helped her with the bath, with the medicine, with the adaptation. And one afternoon, while I was cutting fruit in the kitchen, Paula called me into the room. She was holding a drawing in her hands. She, Pedro, Manuel, and I, all holding hands, with a smiling sun above. "This is our family now," she said. And then she added, "Can you be my real mother?" I knelt in front of her, hugged her tightly, and promised, "I will be everything you want, every day." At that moment, I understood that motherhood is not always born of blood. Sometimes it springs from constant affection, from daily presence, from the silent love that holds your hand even on difficult days. The following days were marked by a different, more solid peace, Even with the difficulties of Paula's recovery, the house was full of care. Pedro was protective, Manuel was more relaxed, and I felt whole for the first time in a long time. I began to rethink my plans to return to the capital. College, internships, everything that had once been my only direction now seemed distant, like a life that no longer belonged to me. Manuel, noticing my internal conflict, did not pressure me. He just looked at me with that way of his, as if to say, "You are free, but if you want, stay." And it was one night after putting the children to bed that he told me bluntly, "I know you have your plans, your paths, but if you decide to stay, I want you to know that this place is yours too. Not just the house, but everything." And when he said everything, I understood exactly what he meant. I didn't answer right away. I went to sleep with my heart full and my head buzzing. I woke up before sunrise, walked around the house, touched the walls, smelled the coffee that hadn't been made yet. I saw the drawings on the fridge, the dirty boots in the corner of the living room, the toys scattered around, and I understood. This was my home, not because I had planned it, but because life had somehow led me there. I made coffee, called the children, and when Manuel appeared at the door, unshaven and with his eyes still puffy from sleep, I said, "I'll stay. For you. For me." He didn't say anything. He just came over and hugged me. It was a long, tight hug, the kind, that says what no words can say. Pedro, of course, wanted to know if this meant marriage, and Paula asked if she could call me her mother for good. I smiled and said yes. And that was how, without ceremony, we became a family. After that day, everything took on a new rhythm. It wasn't just about adaptation anymore. It was about staying. We started making plans together. We renovated one of the bedrooms in the house to turn it into a study space for the children. We planted new trees in the garden, with each one's name hanging on wooden plaques. And little by little, the past lost its strength. Not because it was forgotten, but because we learned to live with it without letting it define our steps. Manuel still had more withdrawn days, and I also faced my insecurities. But now there was an us to sustain it all. One night, when the power went out because of a heavy rain, we gathered by candlelight in the living room. Paula sang a song she learned in school. Pedro pretended to be a monster to scare us, and Manuel played the guitar for the first time since Helena's death. It was imperfect, out of tune, but so full of life that my chest ached with gratitude. The city community, which had previously seen me as an outsider, began to recognize me as part of that story. People greeted me more familiarly, called me by name, and asked for tips on how to care for the animals. I became the horse girl, and later, simply, Lara from the Antunes farm. With each small achievement, I felt my place there taking root. One Saturday, we organized a June festival on the farm. Children from the neighborhood came. There was a bonfire, games, and cornbread made by the grandmother of one of Paula's friends. Amid the music and colorful lights, Manuel approached me and, without saying anything, put a silver ring on my finger. It wasn't a formal proposal. There was no speech. Just a calm, serene gesture, like everything we had experienced up until that point. I hugged him tightly and whispered in his ear, yes. It was the most obvious yes of my life. From that day on, we began to plan the wedding, but without rushing, without any major formalities. We wanted something intimate, in keeping with our story. Paula insisted on designing the invitations. Pedro wanted to be the head of decorations, and Manuel took care of building a small wooden altar under the mango tree behind the house. Everything was simple, but full of meaning. I could see in the children's eyes the good, anxiety of someone who senses that something beautiful is about to happen. And a new serenity grew within me, a calm love that didn't ask for guarantees, but that built certainties in everyday life. One afternoon, sitting in my room, watching the light come in through the window and listening to their laughter outside, I realized that I no longer had any doubts. Everything I had always been looking for, love, meaning, belonging, was there. Not in the way I had planned, but in the exact way I needed it. On the wedding day, the sky looked like a hand-painted image. The ceremony was small, under the mango tree, with the closest neighbors, a few family members, and lots of sincere smiles. Paula walked in wearing a simple white dress and a flower in her hair. Pedro wore suspenders that made him look like a mini-groom. When Manuel saw me walking toward him, wearing a light dress and with tears in my eyes, He put his hand to his chest and took a deep breath. No one said anything too elaborate. There was no exchange of rings at the altar, because they had already been on our fingers since that Saturday at the June festival. But there were sincere words, silent promises, and a kiss that sealed much more than a commitment. It sealed a journey of reconstruction. After the party, at night, when it was just the four of us, Paula lay on my lap and said, "Now we're a real family, right?" And Manuel answered before me, "We always were." As the months passed, we found our rhythm as a family. Mornings began with the sound of children getting ready, the smell of fresh coffee, and Manuel's footsteps across the yard. I took care of the animals, but now I also helped Pedro and Paula with their schoolwork. Sometimes, on quieter evenings, we would all sit on the porch just to watch the sky get dark. There was something sacred about this routine, something that no big city, no academic opportunity, or old plan could offer. I didn't miss the hustle and bustle of the capital, the honking horns, the packed classrooms. My calling was still alive, but now shaped by the reality of rural life, the affections that surrounded me, the needs that called me there. And in the end, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, living a version of happiness that I could never have imagined on my own. One of those peaceful nights, Paula had a nightmare. She woke up scared, crying, saying she had dreamed that I was leaving. I ran to the bedroom, hugged her tightly, and held her face in my hands. "I'm here, my love. It was just a dream," she sobbed, clinging to my pajamas. Manuel appeared at the door and, upon seeing the scene, simply came closer and wrapped us in a group hug. Pedro, sleepy, joined us. We stayed there, huddled together on the children's bed, as if that gesture were our shield against fear. And it was at that moment that I understood the true meaning of staying. It wasn't about promising that nothing would change, but about being there, present, in every fear, in every laugh, in every piece of childhood that unfolded before us. The house wasn't made only of walls, it was made of presence. And that night, more than ever, I knew that I would never leave there again. Over time, I stopped being just a beloved figure inside the house and became a reference outside it as well. People from the city came to me to take care of their animals, ask for advice, and even help with difficult births of cows and goats. Manuel laughed and said that I had become a veterinarian for souls too, because many people left here not only with their animals treated, but with a lighter heart. And I felt exactly that. That place transformed me every day, and that somehow my presence there also made a difference in people's lives. The girl from the big city who only wanted a break during the holidays was now a woman with roots, not out of convenience, but by choice. And it was in this daily choice, made up of small gestures, that love proved to be stronger than any story I could have dreamed up for myself. It was then that, on a normal morning, Manuel called me to the porch. He had a letter in his hand. I thought it was something about the farm, maybe documents. But when he started reading it, I realized it was a letter written by himself. "Lara," it said, "you arrived as if you didn't want to stay, but you stayed as if you always belonged. You healed me without promising anything. You helped me to be a father without demanding perfection from me. You showed me that love is not the absence of pain, but presence even with it." The letter continued with simple but weighty words. And at the end, he said, "I want to grow old by your side, even if we've lived other lives before this one. I want this one to be the one that stays." I couldn't say anything. I just hugged him and let the tears fall. It was the kind of declaration that didn't need an answer, because it already existed in everything we lived day after day. That letter was kept on my bedside table, among photos, notes from the children, and other small mementos of our daily lives. Sometimes I would reread it just to remember where we came from, and to never forget how much that love was built with courage. Pedro and Paula grew up with the security of a solid home, of laughter in the kitchen, of holding hands in difficult times. They became teenagers with strong personalities, but with hearts full of respect and affection. And we, even with the challenges of everyday life, never stopped being partners. We had fights, of course. We had days of silence, and even some when I thought, was it really supposed to be like this? But all it took was a gesture, a look, a conversation in the dark of night, and everything would fall into place again. Because in the end, that was it. Life wasn't perfect, but love was real. And that was enough. Today, looking back, I see how everything fell into place in a way I never would have predicted. The young veterinarian who just wanted some time away from the city ended up finding everything that no city could offer: meaning, connections, a new chance. Manuel, with his silences and depths, taught me that loving is also about relearning. The children taught me how to be a mother, with mistakes, stumbles, but always with a whole heart. And I taught myself to stay, not to run away in the face of fear, not to retreat in the face of what was too intense. Because loving, I discovered, is choosing every day, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. And I chose. I chose this house, this man, these children. I chose this story. And if one day someone asks me if it was worth getting lost on that rural road, I will say, it was there that I finally found myself. Sometimes, when the sun sets behind the hill and the sky turns orange and lilac, I sit on the porch with a warm coffee in my hands and observe everything around me. The trees I planted with the children, the porch that Manuel renovated with such care, the smell of the wet earth after the rain. At these times, I think about everything that could have been different. How many choices I almost made. How many times I thought about giving up, about going back to a more predictable life. But what we built here was not made of certainties, but of dedication, of courage. And that is what I carry with me every day. The certainty that love is not about destiny, but about presence. Of looking into the eyes of the one we love, even on difficult days, and saying, I'm still here. Because it was this silent permanence that transformed a story marked by pain into a new story, full of hope. And if someone is reading this right now, maybe in some corner of the internet, wanting to believe that it is possible to find love after loss, after fear, after chaos, I say, yes, it is. But don't expect it to come like in the movies. True love comes without a script, with calloused hands and a patched heart. It requires patience, listening, daily surrender. I found my love where I least expected it. On a dirt road, on a forgotten farm, in a man who had lost everything, and in two children who just wanted someone to stay. Today, we have a simple life, full of routine, full of the noise of children and the smell of cake in the oven. And honestly, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Because sometimes, what seems to be just a detour on the path is, in fact, the beginning of everything we've always been looking for, without even knowing it existed.